does the CPU matter with your gaming in 4K? So if you ask most people on Reddit as well as just online in general, people will say not really. But no, I'm here to put it to the test because I do have a 4K monitor, bought it in the middle of this year, so I wanted to test it out. So Hardware Unbox actually has done good videos on this issue in the past. Back 1 year ago, they actually did a benchmark with the 70, I believe, 77,000 series AMD Radeon GPUs, and their conclusion was it depends on the game. Then more recently, about 10 months ago, they did another video on it using the 9800 X3D, seeing whether the 9800 X3D is it really faster when it comes to gaming, and then they kind of compared it. It really the answer is that it really depends on the game, depends on the CPU, and so on and so forth. So I'm also here to put it to the test with my personal experience. So let me bring up my video. So I did a side-by-side comparison. First game, let me move my head out of the way, maybe shrink it a little bit. So first game is Apex Legends, a competitive FPS shooting title. So on using the 7000 X3D at 4K high settings, I think no, there's no FSR for this game. I got an average of 188 FPS, but on the 5600 with the exact same most powerful GPU that I have, which is the 9070 XT, I also get 188 FPS. So technically there's no difference. Actually the 5600 average is slightly higher, but basically this is like margin for error. There's no difference between the two CPUs at all at 4K resolution, because if you enable the max FPS settings in Apex Legends, actually the FPS will uncap to a maximum, I believe 300, or is it 240? 240 or 300. So I think it's 240 FPS. It's just the max cap. So you can see that we're not even hitting the max cap. That means basically at 4K high settings, basically we are GPU bound. The GPU is fully utilized, and yeah, the CPU doesn't make a big difference here at 4K. Okay, so let's move on to the next game. Okay, so next game is Counter-Strike 2, CS2. So CS2 obviously is another competitive title. On the 7800 X3D at 4K high settings, we are averaging at 209 FPS. And on the right hand side of the screen, using our 5600, the mid-range CPU from probably about 4 to 5 years ago, we're averaging about 182.2 FPS. So there's a 13% difference, a 13% drop in FPS. And yeah, so it does matter a bit in CS2, even at 4K high settings. That means the 9070 XT is not fully GPU bound. So the CPU does matter in this case. If you see stutterings on the left hand side of the video, take note that it is a codec issue. So when I recorded this, I believe I recorded on the 7000 X3D system, I recorded in the AV1 codec using the 9070 XT. And on the right hand side, I think I didn't record in the AV1 codec, HEVC codec. So when I try to edit those two codecs together in DaVinci Resolve, somehow after rendering it out, it just stutters on the 7000 X3D footage. But take note that in-game is actually pretty smooth. So yeah, does have a difference about 13%, but honestly it's not too high if you're gaming in 4K. And take note that there is a big price difference between these two CPUs at the current market price. 5600, you can get it brand new from places like AliExpress for about 120 to 150 Singapore dollars. The 7000 X3D, to get it brand new, you still have to pay about 400-ish to about $450, I believe was the lowest price that I last saw on the techyard.com. So about a 300 Singapore dollar price difference between these two CPUs. It is quite significant. So if you have a 4K system, no, I would rather you spend more money on the GPU instead of the CPU in this case. Okay, moving on to the next game. So single player titles. This is Cyberpunk 2077. Right now, this first benchmark run is at 4K high native resolution, 70.7 FPS on the 7800 X3D, and on the 5600 CPU, 69.5 FPS. So a very small 2% difference. It is almost margin for error. Yeah, so basically at 4K high native native, that means no FSR upscaling. It is basically the same. Please disregard the stuttering on the left hand side of the screen. Again, it's due to a codec issue when I am compiling, when I'm putting this through my video editing software. So not too sure why it doesn't play well with the AV1 codec. By the way, I'm using DaVinci Resolve. And moving on, so what if we run Cyberpunk 2077 at 4K, high but using FSR quality? Then we will see a little bit more difference in FPS. FPS goes up higher. We have 99.6 FPS on the 7800 X3D, and on the 5600 we have dropped our FPS down to 93 average FPS. So that's the difference of the difference from 2% has gone up to about 7% difference between these two CPUs. Because with FSR quality, we're obviously rendering the game at a lower resolution, maybe at 1440p. I'm not super sure what is the rendering resolution for FSR 4 quality, but when you lower the resolution, you have less load on the GPU, then the CPU becomes more of a bottleneck, so we can start to see a difference between these two CPUs. But at 7%, it is still not a big enough difference to see a big impact in gameplay at 4K. So let's moving on. Next game, Doom: The Dark Ages. This at 4K Ultra TAA. Take note that for Doom, there is no native rendering resolution. The so-called native non-FSR one is TAA upscaling. So at 4K Ultra TAA 7800 X3D 47.2 FPS. On the right hand side of the screen 5600 45.6 FPS. Very minor 3 to 4% difference. Almost margin for error in this case. Very slight difference. So when FPS is this low, well, it doesn't really matter that much. But what if we enable upscaling? So if we at 4K Ultra settings, enabling FSR 3 quality, 7800 X3D will jump up to 71.4 FPS, while the 5600 CPU is only averaging at 67 FPS. So once we enable FSR, we lower the rendering resolution, the difference becomes higher. So there's about a 6 to 7% difference between these two CPUs. Overall, in terms of the gameplay experience, it is still not that big. So pretty small difference. Moving on to competitive titles at Dota 2. So Dota 2 is not a very graphically intense title. It's from more than like 15 years ago. At 4K, best looking preset on the 7800 X3D, we're averaging close to 200 FPS, so 197.8. While on the 5600 CPU, we're only averaging 140 FPS. So this is the biggest difference I have between these two CPUs in this particular game. So there is a 30% difference between the 7800 X3D and the 5600. But all in all, if you're a frequent gamer in Dota 2, actually, even at this high of a FPS difference, like a 30% FPS difference, it doesn't really affect the gameplay, because Dota as a MOBA, I think as long as you are averaging about 60 FPS, you should be able to enjoy the game pretty well. Because it's not really a quick reaction game. It's more of a prediction, like you want to predict what the enemy will do, and then sort of prepare your moves in advance, itemize in advance, things like that. So that's that. So yeah, this is the game with the biggest difference between these two CPUs. Moving on, so Helldivers 2, also another so-called older title from about two years ago. 7800 X3D at 4K Ultra Native Resolution, no FSR, 61.7 FPS. And on the 5600 CPU, we are averaging about 57.1 FPS. So there is a difference of about 7 to 8%. 7.5% basically. So pretty small difference, but with the 5600 we are now like dipping below the 60 FPS mark. So there is that. But then again, for a 300 SGD price difference between these two CPUs, I would probably save that 300 SGD and just enjoy playing at 4K with the 5600, maybe channel it towards a GPU upgrade, buy a better GPU, or maybe upgrade like the SSD, for example. Like at 300 SGD is almost enough money to get us like a 4 terabyte SSD. So we can always channel the money or save the money elsewhere. So technically in this kind of game, the faster CPU doesn't really make a difference at 4K. But what if we enable FSR? So actually I didn't enable FSR. Okay. Yeah, maybe I didn't have that footage here. I think I did enable FSR. Yeah, maybe I didn't. Okay, but anyway, moving on. So another competitive title, Marvel Rivals. High preset FSR 4 quality. Why enable FSR 4 and not native is because, because if you get below 60 FPS, at native is not really a good gameplay experience. So I just wanted to like enable FSR because I think that is what most competitive gamers would do, even if they're gaming at 4K. So 7800 X3D, we're averaging 78.2 FPS, but with the 5600 CPU, we're also averaging about 78.7 FPS. Actually, we see slightly higher FPS with the 5600. So probably margin for error. Maybe I had my system on the 5600 was more decluttered in the OS or something like that. Maybe it was a cleaner install, maybe the drivers were running better, things like that. So basically margin for error. Basically there's no difference in FPS between these two CPUs at 4K, even at FSR for quality. So even on competitive title like Marvel Rivals, if you're gaming at 4K, I believe the 5600 CPU would run fine. Yeah, you would do very well on like a slower CPU. Okay, let's move on a bit. Okay, so now graphically demanding title. This is Elder Scrolls Oblivion. Elder Scrolls is it 4? Elder Scrolls 4. Oblivion Remastered. So at 4K Ultra, this is FSR 4 quality. You can see that it's really demanding game at Ultra settings. 7800 X3D only averaging 45.3 FPS even at FSR 4 quality. And since we are all GPU bound, you can see on the 5600 CPU, we're also averaging at 45 FPS at 4K Ultra settings, 4K Ultra quality settings at FSR 4 quality. So that was quality. So no difference between these two. If we bump it down to performance settings, 4K Ultra FSR 4 performance, 7800 X3D runs it at 63.3 FPS, while the 5600 runs it at 60.9 FPS. So we see about a 4% difference between these two CPUs when we're running at 4K Ultra FSR 4 performance, because I think maybe at performance we're probably rendering at maybe 1080p. So at 1080p, we start to see a little bit of difference between these two CPUs because the rendering resolution is lower. But still, you can see the GPU is still fully utilized, fully bound in Oblivion Remastered, because Unreal 5 engine game, very graphically demanding, especially at 4K. So moving on, next game. So this is Path of Exile 2, a very popular RPG action shooter. At 4K high, no upscaling, because the default is actually NIS upscaling. 7800 X3D runs it at 94.9, while the 5600 at the same settings, 4K high, no upscaling, is running at 98.1 FPS. So it's actually higher FPS on the slower CPU. Like I mentioned, it could be just the 5600 install. The operating system maybe is a little bit cleaner, maybe less bloatware on that OS because it's a brand new install. So the drivers run a bit better, the games run a bit better. I'm not too sure. But basically, I would say there's no difference. Where even for sort of like a pretty non-graphically intensive title, we're still fully GPU bound in this title, in this game. So at 4K settings, if you don't have any upscaling, no difference between these two CPUs at all. So a faster CPU doesn't net you any performance gain. If we enable the default NIS upscaling in Path of Exile 2, then 7800 X3D would see a FPS of 102.3, while again on 5600 it runs faster again at 104.1. I didn't really like double my runs or like triple my runs to double check this, but somehow it's just running faster on the 5600 CPU. I don't know why. Yeah, so don't know why. It's just faster on the slower CPU. But anyway, basically I would attribute it down to margin for error. So no difference between these two CPUs at all. The older CPU would run fine as long as you have a good GPU to run Path of Exile 2 at 4K with NIS upscaling. Okay, moving on, next game. Next game I tested is another graphically demanding game. So this is Warhammer 40k Space Marine 2. At 4K high. Oh, this is typo error here. Yeah, I believe this is typo error. This is, let me double check my spreadsheets. What's my... Yeah, what's the setting that I use for Warhammer 40k? FSR quality, ultra preset FSR quality. So typo error here. but basically I am running Warhammer 40k Space Marine 2 at what's my setting again? Ultra settings at FSR quality. So we are seeing an average at 1700 X3D, an average of 102.3 FPS. Well, this is actually, no, this is wrong. I have a typo error here. So Warhammer 40k Space Marine 2 at 4K, on the 7800 X3D system, actually I'm averaging 70 FPS. So if you look at this counter here, actually in the end I will hit 70 FPS. This is at 4K ultra settings with FSR quality enabled. But on the 5600 CPU, I'm only averaging like 55 FPS. So you can see on the top right hand corner here, please ignore this. This is a typo from the previous run that was from the Path of Exile 2. So there is a difference. The difference actually is pretty significant. So we are having a difference of about 22%. So 55 FPS average on the 5600 CPU and an average of about 70 FPS on the 7800 X3D. So difference of well over 20%. So like what certain benchmarkers or YouTubers have mentioned, Warhammer Space Marine 2, this particular game, it is pretty CPU demanding because there's a lot of enemies that appear on screen, so on and so forth. So in this case, the faster CPU does make a big difference, like around a 20% gain when you're running on the 7800 X3D compared with the 5600. So in this case, the faster CPU does make a difference. So all in all, if we were to try and get some conclusions, it really depends on the game. But out of the majority of the games that I tested here, most of the games have no difference between the slower CPU and the faster CPU at 4K graphical settings, 4K resolution. The only games that will have a big difference are probably very non-graphically demanding games. I believe, what was my example here? Dota 2, non-graphically demanding, then there was a big difference in the FPS. Or very CPU intensive games such as Warhammer Space Marine 2, very CPU demanding, then there's a difference between the FPS when using a faster X3D CPU. So, but majority of the situations, you will probably not benefit from the faster CPU. So if you're gaming at 4K, yes, it does make sense for you to maybe save some money. You don't really need to upgrade your CPU, but channel the money into a better, faster GPU instead. All right, and that's it for this video. So we'll see you guys in the next one.